Congressman Mike Doyle, representing Pennsylvania's 18th Congressional District, as well as my congressman. Representative Doyle, how are you today?
I'm good, Rabbi. Thank you so much for doing this today. I wanted to come on initially with my mask on to drive home a point that all of us have a responsibility to ourselves, our families, our neighbors, and our communities to wear a mask, especially when we're inside a building or around groups of people. I will take my mask off right now. I am actually in my office in Washington, D.C., which has been closed down for quite some time. My staff works remotely from their homes. And so I'm the only person in this office that's been vacant for quite some time. So it's okay for me to be here speaking to you today without my mask on. But as I walk through the House office buildings in the Capitol inside, we wear masks at all time on the House floor. At our committee hearings when we have them, although we've been doing those remotely also recently, we wear our masks. And as we see in hotspots across our country and in our own county of Allegheny County, where we've done such a good job and come so far, but have seen an alarming number of spikes in the last couple of days that has forced the county executive to make some very tough and unpopular decisions, but I believe the right decisions to get us back on track, that all of us, especially our young people, I'm father, my wife and Susan and I have 4 children that are in that group of 30-year-olds, 20, 30-year-olds that pretty much think they're invincible and have been anxious to get back out and socialize with their friends. I just encourage all of us when we do that to think about the people around you and your own family, and make sure you're wearing a mask and social distancing and just the common sense things that we all have a responsibility to do. This pandemic won't be beaten by any one measure. It's going to be all of us taking responsibility to do these things that we know are these common sense things to do to make sure we're not spreading the virus. So let me just start with that and say thank you to everyone that's on today. And I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, and thank you again so much, not only for joining me, but for that important reminder. Those masks go such a long way to protect others, not just ourselves. And we have a lot to do as a society, and I want to ask you about that a little bit more later on as well, just to make sure we keep conveying that message. But I'd love to begin, if you will allow, with the fact that the news cycle has inevitably moved on, although our hearts still grieve with the family of George Floyd and with the millions of Americans who are suffering from systemic racism in this country each and every day. You've been outspoken in calling for and in working for criminal justice reform, policing reform. Would you share a little bit, Congressman, about why this is so important to you and what you're working on right now?
Yeah, I think this is the discussion we need to have. You know, racism that's been born from slavery is really America's original sin. And we've never really dealt with it in a forthright way. And unfortunately, it's crept into every corner and every facet of American society in systematic ways. So one of the places where we see it as most insidious and systematic is in our criminal justice system. And I think we need to continue to have these frank discussions with one another. As you know, the House of Representatives passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act just the other week. And we're hopeful to engage the Senate in a way that can get this bill through the Senate and signed by the president, although there are some tough issues and some things that I think we're going to have a hard time compromising. There's some things that we feel are very important that are parts of this bill that need to be kept in the bill. I want to stress too that the bill is not a response, it is not an anti-police response. Policing and those people who serve us as police officers are one of the toughest jobs in the country. And nothing in this bill, I want to stress, does anything to harm a police officer who's doing their job in the way it's meant to be done. This doesn't hurt good police officers. But what it does do is hold those police officers who aren't following their procedures, these so-called bad police officers, it's holding them accountable in ways they've never been held accountable before. The idea of a registry that identifies police officers who have received multiple levels of discipline for their actions, or who have been fired from departments and then only to land in another department and repeating the same kind of behaviors. We think a national registry is a very important step in doing this. We need to demilitarize our police forces too. They're there to protect and serve us. They're not meant to be an army force. The idea of the surplus military equipment going to police officers, we don't think that's a necessary thing. The other thing is we need some standards, national standards. And they should first and foremost apply in the hiring process. Why does someone want to be a police officer? That's a very important question I think we need to ask. We need to get back to more community type policing. Some of this has been a result of court decisions where residency requirements were outlawed as illegal by the courts. But more and more, we see the importance of a police department knowing their community, getting out into the community and talking to groups of people and organizations and knowing the people in the community and establishing that relationship between the police officer and the person in the community. So they're not someone seen as they should be afraid of or fearful of or contemptible of, but someone that they see as someone there to serve them and protect them. That's very important. Standards on the use of force, I think, is very important and needs to be uniform across the country. You obviously don't fire at someone running away from you. If your life is not being directly threatened, if you're not in danger of some deadly force being used against you, you should not be able to use deadly force against the person that you're trying to arrest or confront. And clearly, we've seen cases in our own city, in Pittsburgh with Antoine Rose, and multiple other cases as people were actually fleeing police officers and they were discharging their weapons. That needs to change, and it needs to be uniform across the country. There's many other things, but we need to reestablish a level of trust between our police officers and the community. And I want to emphasize too that nothing in this bill does anything to harm a good police officer. And this is not an attack against the police. We also need to look at some of the things that have been put on law enforcement over the years that more rightfully should be placed in other places. When you think about homelessness, when you think about drug addiction, when you think about mental illness, the failure of the federal and state governments to address these issues in a substantive way, providing adequate funding and resources, has led a lot of this burden to fall on law enforcement. We see the irony of jails becoming the housing centers for the mentally ill. This has to change too. So when you hear about people wanting to change the focus of what police officers do, when you hear the term about defunding the police, I don't necessarily see this as an issue where we're talking about disbanding or cutting down the number of police officers. I think we're talking about changing some of the focus of how we spend our dollars to make sure that we're getting out and dealing with mental health issues, with issues of homelessness, with people who have drug addictions, and domestic violence. These are all issues that have been woefully underfunded historically by state and local governments and the federal government. And I think that's what we're looking at, is to start to change some of that focus and making sure we're getting those kinds of resources into our communities that are going to help rather than exacerbate the difficulties and the problems that we see in some of our communities. So that's part of the focus behind it, and the need to build public support for it. amongst all people, liberal, conservative, Republicans, Democrats, all races. We need to come together as a country and confront these things that we know are real. We no longer can deny what we're seeing with our own eyes. And we need to have frank, thoughtful discussions, but not just discussions and studies, but action. And that's important too. We don't need to study this anymore. We know what we're confronting. We need some actionable legislation that can be implemented, whether it's done from a national standard or whether it's done to get resources down to local departments. I think about our own county. Allegheny County has, and it's unique in some respects when I talk to my colleagues, we have 130 political subdivisions in our county. So as the member of Congress who represents the bulk of Allegheny County, I have the entire city of Pittsburgh and another 55 suburban communities around the city of Pittsburgh. So I have like mayors, I have 2,000 council people. When I tell my colleagues this, they may deal with one county executive, one municipal body. Every one of those municipalities has a police department. Some of these police departments just have part-timers. I know of areas around where I live in the eastern suburbs where we have police officers that work a couple days a week in one borough and then a couple days a week in another borough. They are paid $10 to $15 an hour. This is a prescription for failure. And I think we need to really rethink policing in our county too, in a different way too. Do we really need 100 different police departments that all have different standards of training, different salary levels, different policies? Or do we need to start thinking more, even if we do it on a regional basis where the city, may have its own department and they have a large budget and a lot of officers, but maybe, the rest of the county, Allegheny, Northeast, Southwest, where officers are trained, where there's required schooling and where there's continuing education, that every year officers go back to school, to the classroom to reinforce the standards, the training, the types of things that we want to see implemented in community policing. That's really a discussion at the local level for the people of Allegheny County. But I think it's something I wanted to throw out there just as a resident of the county. I've lived in my district. I've only lived in two communities my entire life, both in the eastern suburbs, Swissvale and Forest Hills. And I've seen these small town police departments. And I was a borough councilman in my 20s in the borough of Swissvale. And at the time, this is back in the early 70s, we had 22 full-time police officers. Today, all these municipalities can't afford all full-time police officers. They have a couple, and then they have a lot of part-time police officers. It's changed, and the economics of some of these small towns have changed. And we need to rethink how we do policing. So that's what I'm involved with. I try to work with our officials at the county, state, and local levels. But the federal government is more a conduit for resources that flow down to state governments, which flow down to county governments, which flow down to municipalities. And a lot of what we're trying to do with these community policing grants is to get resources to communities so that they can reimagine how policing is done in their communities and take those initiatives too. I don't believe in a lot of things, one size fits all necessarily is the right way to go. Although I do believe we need some national standards on use of force and some other matters. So I hope that wasn't too lengthy of an explanation.
No, I appreciate
That's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I appreciate your comprehensive answer as well as the comprehensive nature of your answer. This is a long, ongoing, multifaceted problem, and it takes deep conversation and, as you say, moving to action. And I appreciate all of the different facets you are considering. There's another aspect of racial justice that I wanted to bring up with you, namely voter disenfranchisements and efforts to prevent equitable access to to the democratic process. I read with interest your media release and your remarks on social media disinformation, that lies that people are allowed to propagate on Facebook and Twitter. You said, and I quote, "Social media companies need to step up to protect our civil rights, our human rights and human lives, not sit on the sidelines as our nation drowns in a sea of disinformation. Make no mistake, the future of our democracy is at stake and the status quo is unacceptable," end quote. I couldn't agree more, and I'm wondering what Congress is working on, how you're trying to find ways to wade into this thorny problem as well.
Yeah, this is very important to me. As you know, I chair the Communications and Technology Subcommittee on Energy and Commerce. So this is right in the wheelhouse of my committee. And we just recently held a virtual hearing on misinformation in social media. When you think back to the last presidential election, we now know that there were several groups outside our country. In one example, a Russian-led group that was targeting specifically African-American voters. They did it initially by creating a site that actually spoke to a lot of issues that were being confronted in the African-American community in a very supportive way. And they basically spent months building up trust and credibility with the people that were watching their site in that community. And then as it got closer to the election, tried to convince those same people that the way to send a message would be not to vote, to stay at home and don't vote. And it was a deliberate scheme to gain someone's trust under false pretenses, not knowing who this really was, and then at the end presenting the solution to be not to participate in the election. We can't let that continue to take place. You know, it's ironic, both Republicans and Democrats are attacking the social media company, but for different reasons. We feel that they need to step up and do more to stop this flow of misinformation that they know is being permeated through social media, where the Republicans want them to do less, and where the president has come out and directly threatened social media companies that tried to say that some of his actions violated their standards. We saw instances where Facebook actually rewrote some of their guidelines to accommodate what the president was doing because they didn't want to get into a dispute with him. This has to change. And one of the tools in our disposal, but it's a very tricky proposition, is Section 230. This is the Telecommunications Decency Act, and it basically gives social media companies, these platforms, liability shields against third-party postings. So what we're saying is that you can't hold Facebook liable for what someone else posts with a third-party post on their site. But in return for that liability shield, they have a responsibility to make a good faith effort, and that's the term of law, to police their sites. And what we've seen is that they've been good at policing their sites against certain types of criminal behavior, whether it's pornography or hate speech. But they've done a very poor job, or they don't want to do the job at all, of confronting what is obviously misinformation. Like when the president says that voting by mail creates fraud, when study after study after study has made it very clear that that's not the case. Those kinds of things need to be confronted also, that they're not factual, and then an education piece, and then a reference to something that would give people information on what reality is. This war got started with Twitter when they finally posted that this wasn't true. So what we're saying to the social media platforms, and we have to be careful, because if you take away the liability shield altogether, then all of these sites would virtually have to shut down. I mean, they'd just be awash in lawsuits. So it is important that we maintain some sort of liability protection, but we also need to change, I believe, make some reforms to Section 230. We did a hearing about a year or two ago on the same issue. And I made a statement to Zuckerberg and all of the social media companies that they needed to do a better job cleaning up their sites before we did it for them. And that what they shouldn't want is for Congress to pass a law to force them to do what they should be doing already. So just the threat of regulation, we were hopeful, would have them be more compliant in making that good faith effort to get this misinformation and other things off their sites. Unfortunately, that hasn't worked. And so now many of the members of my committee and Jan Schakowsky, who chairs the Consumer Protection Committee, we're looking at some innovative ways that we may be able to reform Section 230 and do a better job of making sure this is so important going into the presidential election year that we're going into, that people are not being subjected to sites that are run by bots or by groups that aren't clearly identified. You know, when I run a television ad, when I'm running for re-election, at the bottom of that ad, it's required by law that says paid for by Doyle for Congress. So people know who's paying for that ad. So if I make a statement about something, that they know I'm the person that's paying for that. This post you see on social media, we often never know who's behind it, you know, who the person is posting it. Many, it's done anonymous or with anonymous names. And in many cases, we've been able to discern that many of these are foreign governments that are trying to influence our elections in this country. That's got to change. I strongly believe that any political type of speech on the internet should have a disclaimer on it. We should know exactly who those folks are that are making the statements, and that should be vetted before they're allowed to put those statements on social media. I know that's something social media companies don't want to have the burden of having to do, but if they want to continue to operate, and they make hundreds of billions of dollars on this model, I mean, they want the dissension. This is more eyeballs on their site. They want sites that tell people what they want to hear. And that's all well and good as long as it's information that's true and that we know where that information is coming from. So I think a lot more transparency is needed in this area. And because social media has become so big and such an influencer in our country in terms of political discourse and just about everything else we do, that it's important that we get more transparency, and that's what we're going to work towards.
Absolutely. I think that ascertaining the veracity of information before you is a modern form of illiteracy. If you are simply spouting back what you are reading, you are participating in unhealthy ways for the future of our democracy, and better to at least see the bias, to label it, to recognize it. And then if you believe it, that's a separate issue. But if you are being deliberately misled, it's a challenge for democracy.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times our office has been called, or I've been stopped by someone who says, I can't believe that you guys are doing this or something. And I'd say, where did you hear that? And it's like I saw it on the internet. And I'm constantly directing people to Snopes.com or PolitiFact or, you know, some of these fact-checking websites. I said, at least do yourself the justice of going to some of these fact-checking websites and at least seeing the source of this and then make your mind up. But everything that's on the internet isn't true. And people hopefully should know that by now.
That's right. That's right. So shifting gears one more time to COVID-19 and the pandemic, wave one seems to not only be continuing unabated, but rising exponentially. And we're still starting to grow concerned about a second wave, if we can ever end the first. I'm curious what the federal government is looking toward. What possible relief for individuals, what measures to enforce some of the scientifically proven things we know can make a difference, what might a federal government response look like as we head into the fall?
Well, we've got a lot more that needs to get done. It starts with leadership. And unfortunately, the leadership at the top is still in a state of denial. To hear the president make statements as recently as a week or so ago that this virus is simply going to just disappear someday, to see him not set an example about wearing masks, to watch Tulsa, Oklahoma on television and to see crowds of people right next to each other without masks on, and then to see that replicated in other areas, because a lot of people believe this isn't serious, that it's really not going to hurt them, and that everyone's going to get it. So you might as well get it and get it over with. We've got to change that kind of thinking, and it starts with leadership at the top. I'm glad to see the vice president finally saying that it's a good idea to wear a mask. Our scientists, our medical experts, the people we should be listening to, Dr. Fauci and others have made it clear that our best defense against this virus right now is the personal responsibility we all take to practice social distancing, to wear a mask, and to stay out of large crowds, especially indoor large crowds, if we don't absolutely have to be there. That's what we need to do right now to make sure we're not overwhelming the healthcare system. We're seeing in Arizona and Texas and Florida, those systems under tremendous pressure right now. And governors of those states who initially said we're not shutting anything down, we're keeping our economy open, are now having to pull backwards because of what they're seeing. This is hitting rural America now too. It's just not an urban virus. The coronavirus does not discriminate against red states or blue states, or liberals or conservatives, or Democrats or Republicans. This is an equal opportunity virus that is going to infect everyone if we don't take measures personally to protect ourselves. And we are first and foremost the ones that have to do that. Second, we need to get more out to the community. It was shameful, in my opinion, the lack of personal protection equipment that was made available to our first responders, the people that work in our healthcare systems, the people that ambulance people, the people that work in our grocery stores, the lack of good equipment for them. We need to continue to do that. The president should have had the Defense Procurement Act enacted right away. And we also find out how vulnerable we are as a country when we don't make anything anymore in the United States, when we're dependent on other countries to give us what we need, whether they were swabs or masks or gloves. The idea that many of us states had to compete against each other bidding for these things. We didn't have a national plan to make sure that this equipment was distributed where we need it. And we have to prepare for a second wave. We don't know for certain that there's going to be a second wave, but we know this. We need to prepare for one. You prepare for the worst and you hope for the best. We're still in this first wave, and we're getting to a point in a lot of these states where if we don't put a hard stop and the brakes on the things that are spreading this disease, it's going to overwhelm some of these areas. So we need to get more PPE. We need to get more money to state and local governments. Their budgets are absolutely being crushed as a result of the lack of revenues coming into them as a result of the pandemic. The CARES Act provided $150 billion. We need to do much more than that. We passed in the House the HEROES Act that was going to provide $1 trillion for state and local governments. Pennsylvania alone would get $19 billion from that, but it also gives aid directly to municipalities. So the state gets a chunk, $500 billion in direct assistance to the state. Local governments, $385 billion. So our county, Allegheny County, would get money. Local municipalities would get money to help them deal with coronavirus-related expenses that they've incurred as a result of this pandemic. It's a $3 trillion bill, but $1 trillion of it, a third of it, goes directly to state and local governments. We think that's very important. We need to do a better job to get resources out to people. The unemployment, the federal unemployment PUA expires at the end of July. Well, this virus hasn't expired. And as we see Allegheny County going into shutdown again, with restaurants and bars, you're going to see more people laid off as a result of that. And just at a period of time where here we are moving into the beginning of July, and in 30 days, that assistance, that pandemic unemployment assistance being provided by the federal government, most importantly to self-employed people and independent contractors. And these are some of the people that are getting laid off at the highest rates. Think about, your small business people, your restaurant owners, the people working in the service industries. These people are mostly self-employed or independent contractors. They're not eligible for traditional unemployment insurance. So they can't go to the state of Pennsylvania when they lose their jobs and say, I want to collect unemployment. It was the PUA, the special program that the federal government funded, that made for the first time available assistance for independent contractors and small business people that were self-employed. And self-employed people, the persons that do so many things for you that aren't allowed in your homes anymore because of the shutdown, and they can't work. To cut them off in 30 days from now is just unthinkable. Yet we haven't been able to get the Senate to move on the HEROES Act. We've passed it in the House. Mitch McConnell keeps saying, well, let's wait and see. Well, this virus isn't waiting to see anything. It's spreading, and it's spreading all over the country now. And the idea that we would cut people off in 30 days from now from any assistance doesn't make a lot of sense to me. My hope is that between this week that we're in session and we'll be in session the last 2 weeks of June, it is our sincere hope that we have a negotiation taking place over the 2 weeks we're not here, which will result in some sort of a passage of a bill that follows the guidelines of the HEROES Act. It might not be exactly like the HEROES Act in the House, but something we can get passed through the Senate and get the president to sign to make sure that we just don't cut people off on July 30th, or you're going to see a lot more pain in this country. I know people are really upset when things get shut down. I mean, I saw what our county executive had to do the other day, and he's just getting, he's really taking a lot of criticism. But I want to tell you something. We need to be very serious about this. And the idea that we would come so far in our county to be actually one of the counties that set an example on how to do it right, and then to see us just fall back to where we were at square one because all of a sudden we've just decided this is over and we can just act like we did before the virus ever came. We can't do that. And this complete shutdown, it needs to happen for a while. But more importantly, when we reopen again, and we will, these businesses will reopen, we have to change our mindset about how we conduct ourselves when we're out and about. If you feel like you have to go inside a bar of crowded people, and I don't know why anybody would want to do that right now, if you're not wearing a mask and if you're not keeping at least 6 feet away from the person next to you, you're contributing to the spread of the virus. I mean, this just has to be said to individuals that everybody has a responsibility in this. It's not just the job of the county health department or the state department or the federal government. This is the responsibility of every person, all of us together, to have that responsibility and to our families and our friends and our neighbors, not to be contributing to the spread of this virus, but to be the people that are taking the steps to help contain it. And when we all buy into that, and it would be nice to have some leadership at the very top singing that message to the American people, instead of ripping off social distancing stickers in the rally in Tulsa that was going to keep people 6 feet apart. At some point, the leadership needs to come from the front. Thank God for the fact that people like Dr. Fauci's and others haven't been completely muzzled. Although the Corona Task Force hasn't been holding the briefings that they used to be holding daily, they're more sporadic. But we have to listen to the medical professionals, to the scientists, to the epidemiologists who've spent their whole lives studying viruses like this and trying to understand their behaviors and how they mutate and how we start to look at vaccines. These are the people we should be paying attention to. And unfortunately, the sad reality is too many Americans haven't been listening. And that's why we're seeing what we're seeing. So we've got to take this responsibility on all of us. It's not just up to our leaders and our scientists and our doctors. It's up to each and every one of us.
That's right. You know, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs has a great quote about why people of faith are great partners in working against climate change and all of the larger societal ills. He said, we're used to banging our heads up against the wall, wondering if the actions of one person will make a difference. And here is absolute proof that those actions do make a difference, that we each have something to do. Representative Doyle, representing the 18th Congressional District, my representative, thank you so much for your time this morning. I'm grateful.
Rabbi, thank you for doing this, and let's continue to keep in touch with one another. I think that's very important. Let me encourage people who are watching this today to go on to my site. We have an e-newsletter that we put out monthly that we keep people up to date on what's going on here in Washington, D.C., what we're doing to combat COVID, how you sign up for various programs that may be available, whether it's for unemployment assistance. We just passed as part of a bill yesterday too, assistance for renters and homeowners, that people that can't pay their rent or people that are in danger of going into foreclosure. I know the state of Pennsylvania has also come out this week and extended the moratorium on foreclosures or evictions. We think that's important, but we also know that even though some people may be in forbearance, that those payments are stacking up. And it's the same with rent too. And so the question is when this program ends and you haven't paid your rent for 5 months and all of a sudden you got 5 months worth of rent due and you just got back to work, and you don't have any excess income, how do you deal with a situation like that? So these are some of the programs that we're trying to put into place that would help people deal with those kinds of issues too. And all this information can be discerned by keeping in touch. If you just go on to doyle.house.gov, one of the first things you'll see is sign up for my e-newsletter. And if you put your email address in there, you'll get sent that automatically each month. And we'll keep you up to date on what's going on. I think it's important that we share good information, accurate information, and give people the resources or point them in the direction of where these resources are locally if they're experiencing problems trying to pay their rent or they're afraid of losing their homes or they want to know where the nearest test site is or they want to know, what's going on in terms of what the medical experts are saying. We try to keep abreast of that, and then all the legislation that we're trying to get passed here out of Washington, D.C., that will bring some resources down to the state and county and local level for people that are struggling with this. So I would encourage that, and I want to thank you for doing this, and proud to have you as a constituent in the 18th Congressional District. This is a great district that I have lived in all my life and love dearly. And the people of this district are good people too. And I think the progress you've seen in Allegheny County initially in battling this virus has been because that we have largely been compliant. We just have to remind ourselves sometimes not to get complacent, and especially our young people. And I say this as the father of 4 children, that I'm constantly reminding my children who are anxious to get back out there and do what they love to do, that they have to do it in a socially responsible way. And that means wearing a mask and practicing social distancing. It can't be said enough times. I know I've said it a million times. I'll say it 1,000,001 times that we've got to do this. But thank you, Rabbi.
So important. Thank you.